Once again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I am very excited. This is the first program in a new series called Wild Maine that the Camden Public Library is having in partnership with the Center for Wildlife Studies. And to tell you a little bit about the Center for Wildlife Studies and to introduce tonight's presenter, I would like to turn the program over to Jack Hopkins. Jack, you can unmute yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Julia. Before I introduce Greg, I want to tell you a little bit about the Center for Wildlife Studies. So we're a Maine-based nonprofit organization. Our mission is to provide accessible environmental education and to promote global wildlife conservation through science. In addition to our research, which we conduct all over the world, we also train students and professionals from around the world, regardless of their financial status, to address the major environmental challenges of the 21st century. These things include biodiversity decline, species extinction, climate change, and emerging threats to both human and wildlife health. So today we're kicking off our new community education series, like Julia said, with the Camden Public Library called Wild Maine. And the purpose of this program is to educate our community about Maine's amazing natural resources and how our community can get involved in citizen science opportunities, just like the Big Night. Following Greg's talk, consider supporting our mission by giving a tax-deductible donation to our organization, the Center for Wildlife Studies. So now I'm pleased to introduce Greg LeClaire. Greg's a PhD candidate at the University of Maine, Orono. I originally met Greg about, well, I think it was 2016. I was a wildlife professor at Unity College, and at that time, Greg was working tirelessly on a wood turtle study that one of my colleagues was the PI on. And Greg, after about 1 year of being there, I learned that he was our gold standard of a student. It's no surprise now that Greg is currently working on his PhD. He's investigating environmental DNA and the applications of it to study threatened wood turtles, which he studied at Unity College, as well as Canadian lynx. And of course, he's finding time to disseminate this message about the Big Night, this community science project that he started 5 years ago. So with no further ado, Center for Wildlife Studies is proud to be supporting such an important grassroots project like the Big Night. So Greg, take it away. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Great, thanks to both of you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to share this with you. So I will share my screen. And hopefully, actually, hang on one second. We are on the wrong slide to start with, so we're going to change that really quick. There we go. Okay, great. Again, thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you to Camden Public Library, to Jack, Center for Wildlife Studies, for bringing this all together. I am so excited to share with you not only my work from the past 5 years, but also these amazing creatures that we just don't get to learn enough about. So I want to start you all off where I started actually about 20 years ago, back in 2002, when I had my first hands-on wildlife experience that really sold me on becoming a wildlife biologist when I was just 7 years old. So hopefully you'll hear some sounds here in a second. So relax, enjoy, and let's get started. So hopefully what you just heard there were spring peepers, and if you had a keen ear, you also might have been able to pick out the quacking wood frogs. But this sound formed the backdrop for my first experience that I was just describing to you. I was coming home with my family. We were pulling into my driveway. It's nighttime, it's April, it's raining, and we're walking to our front door when we noticed a shadowy figure in the driveway. And it happened to be my very first encounter with a spotted salamander. So when I was 7, I was already really into wildlife, but I did not know the local salamanders very well. I had been flipping rocks and logs for quite a while and been finding redback salamanders and newts, but had never seen this species before. And this was also way bigger than any other salamander I'd seen. So imagine a 7-year-old kid who's already really into wildlife finding this salamander that's like 6 inches long in his driveway, that's all black with yellow spots, and just how exciting of an experience that was for me. And before we get into what was going on this evening, I just want to share with you how amazing this creature is. So the spotted salamander is the only vertebrate on the planet that we know of that can photosynthesize like a plant, which is an amazing ability. So when it's juvenile, actually, even while it's still in the egg, it forms this relationship with algae that allows it to get extra oxygen while it's in the egg. And in turn, the algae gets whatever it needs to live, energy of some sort, by living within the egg of this animal. And it's known that the algae survives into the adult form of this animal. So it's possible that even as adults, they can still photosynthesize to some degree, but kind of a useless power when you're underground for the entire year and only come up at night. So who knows how useful it actually is as an adult, but regardless, not only are they really amazing looking creatures, but they have some amazing abilities as well. So when I saw this spotted salamander, it was likely a male or female moving to a pool that looks like this. And many of you have probably heard the word vernal pool, and many of you might not have. So to familiarize ourselves, a vernal pool is actually a significant wildlife habitat here in the state and actually the Northeast. And what makes it significant is the fact that it's this temporary body of water. So it looks like a puddle. And at first glance, that's basically what it is. But it's a puddle that tends to hold water from springtime to mid to late summer. And the fact that it's not permanent is what makes it so special. So for example, species like fish, they can't survive in a place that dries out every year, right? But then there's also other amphibians that can't as well. For example, bullfrogs, green frogs, they need permanent water to survive. Their tadpoles, it takes them 2 years to turn into an adult, whereas a spotted salamander, its young will be laid as eggs in April, and then typically by July or August, not only be hatched out, but transformed into adult form animals. So they develop very quickly. And you'll find other species in vernal pools as well. Fairy shrimp are vernal pool specialists, which are amazing creatures. They look like little brine shrimp. And what makes them so amazing is, first of all, they're vernal pool specialists, but second, their eggs can last so long dried up in the soil that if you have fairy shrimp in your vernal pool, it's possible those were laid before European settlers even came to the continent. They can last hundreds of years in the soil. Pretty amazing species. And while I can talk about vernal pool ecology quite a bit, let's move on and talk about what is happening in these vernal pools. So if you look in a pool at the right time, you might see quite a lot of action going on. So spotted salamanders, for example, might be writhing all around each other, doing what's called the salamander dance. Typically, though, the males will show up first and lay what are called spermatophores, which are little sperm packets for the females to pick up later. You might see wood frogs rolling around in a big ball with each other, maybe blue spotted salamanders. It's a pretty happening time in those pools. And then this is the final product of those nights when everything is happening. These are the egg masses of spotted salamanders from at least 2 individuals here. So these are all about the size of your palm. And she'll lay them attached to a stick or a piece of vegetation somehow. And you can see that some of them are different colored. So we have like these clear masses here on the right. And then on the left, this is a more cloudy egg mass. And depending on the genetics of the female that laid them, they can change color. So some of them will even be green, which is the start of that algae relationship I was talking about before. You can also see a dragonfly nymph starting to eat some of the eggs here. So this is important food for other species. But this is what we tend to see either, depending on where you're on the state, end of April to mid-May is when these eggs start getting laid. And the spotted salamander, as it turns out, is not the only animal that was moving on that night when I first encountered the spotted salamander back in 2002. It was likely that there were other species that I wasn't seeing, including this wood frog, which this is another vernal pool specialist. This is probably one of the most amazing amphibians on the planet, if not for the sole fact that it has the farthest north range of any amphibian, actually amphibian or reptile, because it goes into the Arctic Circle. They can do this because of their ability to freeze almost entirely solid by basically filling their cells up with urine, which is pretty wild, but it's so interesting that space exploration scientists are even studying how wood frogs freeze as a way to keep humans safe during deep space travel. So pretty amazing creature and pretty handsome, if I do say so myself. Then there's the blue spotted salamander, which is another vernal pool specialist. And this is probably the most perplexing amphibian that we have here in Maine, because as it turns out, almost every blue spotted salamander we have in the state is part of this long ancient lineage of all females that somehow are cloning themselves, and they figure it out along the line. And I say figured out, they evolved this special ability along the line where they can interbreed with other species and just use the male sperm to kick off fertilization of the egg and not take any of the male's genetics. So pretty amazing lineage there. We do, I believe, have a few males still kicking around, but very complex genetic situation going on there. In fact, more than I can even really wrap my head around. But then there's also the spring peeper, which tends to be extremely common on these nights. And while it's not a vernal pool specialist, you'll see them everywhere. And of course, you'll hear them as well. And of course, they're such a cute little frog, right? These are about the size of your fingernail. Wonderful little species. And you might even see some uncommon species for these nights. These are more summer species rather than spring species, and typically not migratory. So for example, you have the leopard frog here on the left, which is a species of concern here in the state. The four-toed salamander, which is a sphagnum moss breeding specialist. And then the gray tree frog, which tends to not come out until June or even, or I guess mid-May, and then calling by June. But occasionally we do see this species during April. So when you have all of these amphibians moving at the same time, that's what we call a big night. So to put it in official terms, it's that spring night when you have a large simultaneous migration of thousands of amphibians occurring. And you can see in this bucket here, this is a volunteer on the project that we'll be talking about later, where she was moving some amphibians and had quite a number in a single spot. In fact, if you look closely, you can probably count 3 species. Not only will you see wood frogs and the spotted salamanders here, but there's also blue spotted salamanders hiding in there as well. So why these big nights happen has to do with the biology of amphibians. They're extremely sensitive to their environment. They're cold-blooded. They have very thin skin that requires them to be near water. So we have this Goldilocks set of conditions that has to occur before a movement happens. So first of all, it needs to be springtime, at least here in Maine anyway. There are some species that will migrate in the fall, but we don't have those species here. And usually it's mid-April. However, I've been talking with colleagues about how it's been coming earlier and earlier. In fact, we've had 3 movements already this March, and Thursday, the last day of March, we'll have another big movement. In fact, Thursday will probably be the first like real big night of the season. It's been kind of a trickle so far, but so it's trending a little bit earlier. It used to be around April 20th was our peak, but I think our peak is probably getting closer to April 10th now. The ground needs to be thawed as well. So amphibians can't move out of their underground wintering habitats unless things have thawed out. But sometimes they're close enough to the surface that they could bust out on a pretty warm day, and this does happen occasionally. But if an amphibian were to take the above ground temperature as its cue to move, it would potentially be making a wrong decision, because we get those fool's springs in early March or mid-February where suddenly we have like this 50 or 60 degree day and it feels great. If a frog took that as its cue to move, it would be frozen. It would find the vernal pool to be frozen. It wouldn't survive. So the ground needs to be thawed, and fairly significantly, in order for an amphibian to decide it's time to go. And then again, since amphibians have such thin skin and they need water, the ground needs to be wet. So it needs to be raining to some degree. And again, doesn't need to be a whole lot of rain. Typically, the more rain, the better. But if the ground is wet, that's typically good enough for an amphibian. And then temperatures should be at around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmer, the better. But we can see movements all the way down to freezing. Typically, you only see wood frogs at that cool of a temperature. But the warmer you get, the better you get. And then that 45-degree mark is really where things seem to start to kick off. And by the way, this Thursday, again, it's looking like it'll be right around that temperature. So why are big nights important? Obviously, we can guess that big nights are important for the amphibians themselves, but are they important for other species, including ourselves? Well, first of all, if you know anything about amphibians, you've probably been told that they're ecological indicators. So they tell us when something is wrong with the environment. Either they start growing a third leg or start dying off quickly. And that's because, again, they have that really thin skin that can absorb things very quickly and easily. So if there's something in the water that shouldn't be there, we usually see that show up pretty quickly in our amphibians. Of course, they're also great for controlling insects and invertebrates. Some of the favorite food of larval salamanders, so essentially tadpole salamanders, is mosquito larvae. They eat those things up like French fries. So you can imagine how much they are helping us by removing mosquitoes every spring in the vernal pools. And of course, by the same concept, just the other way around, they are food for other species as well. So they're food for many predators, including anything from bears to coyotes, foxes, raccoons, skunks, but also even owls. They do a great job every spring of being able to pick off some frogs and salamanders that are migrating. I tend to find barred owls are really active during this time and even hear them and see them during big night surveys. And then I'm not a nutritional ecologist by any means, but I am convinced that there has to be something really interesting going on when you concentrate so many frogs and salamanders in single spots. Like, what does that do for the nutrition that's available, the energy? Like, we're talking about a massive amount of amphibians concentrating. So if you were to put all of the amphibians in a forest on one side of a scale and then put all of the other vertebrates in a forest, so all the mammals, the birds, reptiles, all on the other side of the scale, amphibians would outweigh them by a long shot. In fact, even if you just looked at a single species of amphibian, the redback salamander, it would still outweigh all of those other vertebrates combined. So I just have to imagine that there's something pretty interesting going on when you concentrate that many animals into a single spot. And along a similar concept is carbon sequestration, and this is kind of a new thing, but it's been recently found that a single salamander over the course of a rainy season can sequester 170 pounds of carbon. That's amazing. Apparently this is just by eating the insects that would otherwise be eating these leaves, which allows, once the insects are no longer eating them and keeping the carbon from those leaves circulating above the soil, it allows the leaves to sink into the soil and store that carbon underneath the surface of the earth and keep it essentially from recycling in either the atmosphere or on the surface. So it's potentially really great for fighting climate change. So again, just one salamander is 170 pounds of carbon. And then with all of these things combined, we can imagine that this is a significant choke point, not only for the amphibian populations, but also for other animals that depend on them as well with these big nights. So if they go off without a hitch, then great. But if there's a problem, then it's potentially problematic for a variety of species. And to give you some context about how amazing these migrations actually are, if we were to compare the size of the amphibian to the distance that it's migrating, it's immense. So first of all, it's equal to the migration distance that caribou undergo from the boreal forest to the tundra every year, but also it's 13 times greater than the wildebeest migrations that we see in the Serengeti, which is amazing. Like, the Serengeti wildebeest migration is probably one of the most famous migrations on the planet. We're having something 13 times larger right under our noses in our backyards every spring, and most of us are not even aware that it's going on. Just absolutely incredible. And for context about how big these actually are in at least human terms, a wood frog is typically traveling a couple hundred meters but can move up to 1 kilometer, maybe even more, to get to where it's trying to go. In fact, they've been recorded traveling over the top of a mountain range to get to their vernal pools. So these guys can be pretty long distance runners here. Usually it's a couple hundred meters for other species maximum, but it can be quite a distance for these little guys. And in a perfect world, an amphibian would do something like this, where it moves from A to B relatively unimpeded to its vernal pool, maybe dodging a hungry owl or having to crawl over a big log or rock or something. But in the modern world, we have these new, what are called migration barriers, which make it difficult to access where they're trying to go. So for example, the most common barrier that amphibians are facing these days are roads, and usually this is what happens, where they get hit by vehicles attempting to cross. So how big of an issue are roadways? I'm going to give you some statistics here. First of all, in Canada, over the course of 4 years, on a single roadway, there were 30,000 amphibian mortalities recorded. And we'll talk about the results of the project that I'm here to talk to you about soon, but we are 5 years into our project and are nowhere near that many dead. So this was a really deadly road, and it was almost all one species, if I remember correctly. Also, on average, amphibians are looking at about a 1 in 5 chance of being hit when crossing a road. It varies a lot by geography and how many cars are driving on that road. So some roads can get up to 100% mortality, which means that nobody is surviving the crossing. But on average, it's about a 21% mortality rate. So about a 1 in 5 chance of being hit every time they cross a road. And then there's also this evidence, and this is including Maine, where these populations of amphibians are so separated by roads that it's showing up in their genetics. And so essentially these animals are so isolated that over time they just can't exchange genetic information, and these certain genetic markers start settling in that almost end up making these species look like different subspecies or different species. I mean, that's a much larger change that happens over time, but that's essentially how that process works. It's separation for a long period of time, and we've only had roads that are this deadly for a couple of decades. So for this to be so severe and showing up in the genetics of these animals already is pretty amazing. And it's not all species are being influenced the same way. In fact, let's look here at a permanent body of water living amphibian, the green frog. So once in its lifetime, it might move from one pond to another like this, probably a migrating juvenile that's trying to find a new place to go, but that's not even always the case. Sometimes they stay in the same place for their entire lives. So once in their life, they are crossing a road and risking it. Compare that with a wood frog, where once every year they are crossing a road to the vernal pool, crossing the road back after they're done breeding, and then their juveniles are dispersing, a lot of which are probably crossing the same road. So in a single year, they are looking at 3 distinct chances of being hit. Compare that with a single time in the lifetime of the green frog. So it's likely that the migratory species are being influenced more than the species that spend most of their lives in permanent bodies of water. And then if we look at a really wonderful case study done in Western Massachusetts on a spotted salamander population, we find that, well, first of all, this really important idea that the more times you cross a road, the more likely you are to be hit, which makes sense, right? But this paper really drove that home. But this number here at the bottom, a greater than 10% annual adult mortality, means that they will disappear in 25 years or be what's called extirpated. So I will say most of the sites, and again, I know we haven't talked about my project yet, but most of the places we've looked and recorded data in Maine are showing greater than 10% mortality. So it's really concerning to think about. And if you actually think of this question yourself, where in Maine are amphibians likely already gone? Where do you think they might be struggling, or where do you think they're doing just fine? think about that as we continue through the presentation, and we'll revisit that at the end later. So how do we go about reducing amphibian road deaths? First of all, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but this is the #1 threat to the majority of threatened species out there, amphibians being included in that, but we have to either reduce or more intelligently develop, because development is habitat fragmentation, it's habitat destruction, it's introducing cars to places that they used to not be, so we have to develop more intelligently. But the other thing that I think people can do just themselves very easily is consider, first of all, if it's a warm, rainy night in spring, do you drive? If you can skip driving on those nights, you're doing a huge favor for those amphibians. Of course, if it's an emergency, do what you got to do. But if you can limit driving on those nights, that would be fantastic. And I'll show you the data later to prove that this is a real thing that you can do that makes a big difference. And finally, I want to share with you a conservation model that we'll be talking about now for the rest of the presentation, because this is another way that you can help amphibians, and that's the collect, protect, and connect model. So not only does it rhyme, which makes it a lot of fun to practice, but this is a model that's been practiced in many different contexts. But for amphibians, what this means is, first of all, we have to collect the data that is needed to determine where high impact mortality sites are, and then based on that data, protect the natural areas that are needed to sustain these populations. Luckily in Maine, we have what's called the Significant Vernal Pool Program, where if a vernal pool meets certain conditions, it's able to gain special legal protections that essentially means that anytime somebody develops within 250 feet of that pool, they have to do a special consultation to make sure that they're not negatively impacting that pool. But natural areas are only worth so much if you can't actually connect them, because connected natural areas means that, or let's put it this way, if areas are not connected, animals cannot reach all the resources that they need in order to survive. So perfect example being the amphibians. Oftentimes their breeding habitat is a far distance from the rest of their lives. Or if they need to adjust their home ranges due to something like climate change, or connect with other populations to exchange genetic information. These are all things that necessitate connection. So without connection, protected areas are only worth so much. And what this looks like for amphibians is what you're seeing here on the right. That is a Salamander Tunnel that was built in Western Massachusetts. It is the first of its kind in the United States. There are more now, but basically how this works is a migrating amphibian will travel up to those concrete walls and follow those through the tunnel and travel safely to the other side. So how these work is definitely dependent on the materials used and the design and the placement, so it can really vary on how successful they are, but this is something that seems to be the going solution for the future, because otherwise amphibians are being forced to travel over the roads and are being killed anyway. So today, though, I'm going to focus with you on the collection part of this model, because that is where you can all get involved. And that's through Maine Big Night. So Maine Big Night is a community science project where all of you can get involved. It doesn't matter whether you're a scientist or military or a school student or whatever it is. You don't even have to be a Mainer. You can be here from out of state or even out of country. And if you're around and want to survey for amphibians, we'll take you. The only thing that we require is that you be safe in the road, and we do have other requirements to participate, which I'll talk about later. But no matter what your background is, no matter your age, whatever, if you can be safe in the road, you can participate in this project. By the way, this project, again, I mentioned that it doesn't matter what age it is, or what age you are. We have plenty of kids that participate, and many kids even get certified through this project and end up taking their parents out. So Again, the age part doesn't matter. This photo is a wonderful one of a family, and if you're interested, that ID card that they're holding there, those are available online for purchase for, I believe, $10 or $15 a piece. They are life-size watercolor drawings by local wildlife artist Michael Boardman. They're at Coyote Graphics, so if you just Google Coyote Graphics, you should be able to find them on there. They are fantastic and also waterproof, so perfect for these big night surveys. The goals of the project are as follows. Number one, we want to identify the significant and vulnerable amphibian migration routes. So where are the species of concern? Where are mortality rates high? And then we want to provide direct relief of road mortality on those amphibians. So not only helping them cross the road safely, so picking them up and scooting them across, but also using our data to identify candidate sites for those road crossing structures, like the one that I showed you a few slides ago. And three, we want to provide an opportunity for community members to participate in conservation and natural sciences. If you, for example, don't particularly enjoy something like hunting or hiking or fishing or birding, like all these activities that already exist, this is potentially another way for you to get involved. And plus, a more involved and more scientifically literate community is a more successful and happier community. So again, no matter who you are, we hope that we can get you involved. How does the project work? First of all, we have this kind of 4-step overarching plan on how it works. Of course, there's more detail to how this actually goes. But generally speaking, number one, we identify the potential sites for survey. 2, we train and certify volunteers. 3, the volunteers adopt sites. And then 4, the volunteers go and collect data from those sites and then report it back to us so we can actually use that data for management. Training is a fairly straightforward thing. In fact, it's primarily self-led, and that's what makes this project easier to run. We do have a few in-person training sessions every year. Those are done for the year, so if you are interested in those, you'll have to wait until next year. But it is primarily self-led with our online training handbook. Depending on how fast of a reader you are, it can be 20 minutes or it can be 2 hours. And then you take the online training quiz to prove your knowledge, and that's proving knowledge in not only identification and handling of amphibians, but also safety and data collection methods. Then everybody signs a liability waiver. I will say not everybody needs to be certified. If you, for example, are a parent, you can get certified and your kids don't have to. Just everybody has to sign a waiver no matter what. So as long as a certified person is present during data collection, that's all that needs to happen. It's also interesting too, I use the parent as the example there, but in some cases the kids are who get certified and they bring their parents with them. So either one is fine as long as at least one certified person is present. But again, everybody has to sign a waiver just to demonstrate that they know that this is an inherently risky project, because of course you're working in roadways at night in poor conditions. We've never had an accident because again, safety is our priority, but everybody has to be as careful as possible. And then you adopt sites. So no matter where you are in the state, hopefully you can find a site to survey. And I'll show you a map here of where our sites are in a second, but I want to say one more note, which is that if you want to participate, we do require high visibility vests and flashlights be worn and used at all times. But if you cannot find or acquire either one of those items, we have those available for free through a variety of gear hosts through the state that you'll check out just like a library book. So if that's a barrier for you, we've got you covered. And this is that map of sites I was telling you about. This is just a heat map. So you can see that if you live in like the Portland and southern Maine area, you've got a lot of sites available to you. Bangor and Unity are those other little hot spots there. And then you can see even all the way up into Aroostook County, we have a variety of sites available. So hopefully, again, no matter where you are, we have sites available to you. And we also take site requests. So if you happen to know of a site where amphibians are crossing and want to record data, you just tell us where it is, tell us where you've seen amphibians, and we work with you to register that as a new site, and you can adopt it and collect the data there. The presentation up, I want to share with you the results of the project so far. The next few slides are going to show you essentially the same story, so I'll try to move through them a little bit quickly so you don't have to hear the same thing 3 times, but participation has increased every year a lot. So last year alone, we certified 316 volunteers. This year, I think we're currently up to 250-ish, so we'll probably surpass 316. And following that trend of getting more people involved, the number of hours surveyed has also gone up a lot. 2021 especially, because people started bringing their friends and family out. So it's becoming a more social thing, which is great. So you don't need to be certified if you're working with somebody who already is. So for example, we have many families where the parents are certified. Even in some cases, the kids are certified and the parents come along with the kids. Depending on who's certified, like you only need one person to get certified, and then you can bring along your friends and family with you. Just the certified person does have to be the one recording data. And then by consequence of more people getting out in the field, we are seeing more sites getting covered every year. So again, we have about 450 sites available. So we have plenty of room to expand. This year, we've adopted out 220-ish. Usually not that many get surveyed. So typically people will adopt and then some might not get out there. But we'll see. Hopefully we get above 2021's mark. And if you would like to get involved, I would love to get some increased coverage, especially in your areas. A lot of you are probably coming in from the mid-coast region, and I'd love to get some expansion in that area. And then the number of amphibians recorded every year has also gone up. So in total, we've recorded almost 10,000, and I'm sure this year we'll blast past that, hopefully approach 20,000. That's a number I'm really excited about because the majority of these animals have been found and moved alive. So a lot of these animals are probably alive thanks to our volunteers, which is absolutely fantastic. So we're coming back to this question now of where in Maine are amphibians likely gone, where are they struggling, and where are they possibly doing just fine? And I'm going to show you what I think are the answers currently to this question with a map of our 2021 data. What you're seeing here are all these dots that show you where volunteers surveyed in 2021. The size of the dot tells you how many amphibians were located at that site. And then the color tells you how many were found dead. So the redder that dot is, the more amphibians were found dead. And you can see kind of a trend, especially getting into Cumberland County and York County, where circles get small and they get red. So populations are likely less and they are getting hit more frequently. Whereas if we compare to more rural areas, so up near Farmington, I believe this big circle kind of in the center coastal region, like that's near you guys in Camden. I forget which town the big circle would be if it's just west of Camden, but less vehicles, greater populations of amphibians. And then we see these really interesting circles, like this really big one just north of Bangor that's really red. These are these rural areas that are just outside the sprawl of urban development. So this is Orono. And that's a really big circle because there's still a good population of amphibians there, but there's more traffic coming through recently. So they haven't been reduced, but the mortality rates are high. So we have places like Orono, or then if we look just east of Brunswick, same idea. So these are turning a little bit red and getting a little bit smaller, but really interesting trends. Again, this is only 2021 data. I haven't compiled everything from the previous 4 years, but really interesting and kind of, I guess I don't want to call it fun, but intriguing to look at for sure. And then I like to share the most deadly sites we have in the state currently. These are sites that are kind of repeat offenders where year to year, they tend to have really high mortality rates. So first of all, we have Boyd's Corner Road in South Berwick, which has about 60% of amphibians getting hit by cars. Durham Road in Brunswick, 64%. That's a fantastic vernal pool habitat there in Durham, on the Durham Road. Center Road in Gray, 65% mortality. Thorndike Road and Unity, 70% mortality. And then Forest Avenue and Orono, also about 70% mortality. And a good handful of these have species of concern present, like blue-spotted salamanders or leopard frogs, for example. And there are other sites that have scored higher than that, just not year to year. So for example, one site in Orono had 90% mortality, but it was just last year. So we haven't included those in our top deadliest sites list yet. But then there's this really interesting thing that we came across in 2020 when the pandemic hit. So the pandemic occurs in March, and then everything shuts down right before amphibian migration season. So there were a lot less cars on the road, and by consequence, a lot less were getting killed. So in 2020, we saw mortality rates actually get cut in half. This is from a publication that we finally got out last September or last October. So typically mortality rates are around 20%. In 2020, it was cut down to 8%. So great year for amphibians. Maybe we'll see that show up in a greater population over the next few years. Who knows? And then we're returning to normal levels as of 2021. And I bet 2022, this season, we'll see it continue to increase. Another interesting finding, these graphs are a little confusing, so feel free to just listen to my voice here. What you're looking at is a graph comparing how frog mortality responds to maximum daily temperature, and we're comparing that to salamanders. So for some reason, frog mortality picks up a lot as daily temperature picks up, whereas salamander mortality either doesn't or actually decreases a little bit. We don't know why, and we're still toying around with this idea. It's been kind of confusing. Excuse me. And what's interesting is that this trend is even more exaggerated when we're talking about the amount of rain. So as the rain picks up, mortality rates of frogs pick up a lot. Whereas salamanders, it's either neutral or just a slight pickup. So why salamanders respond so much less to the environment, we don't know, but a very interesting idea to try to figure out. And then the last thing I want to mention is a problem that's actually pretty pertinent to you in Camden, because it was one of the first places we noticed it. These are diseased frogs, and they're diseased by road salt. So what happens is road salt runs off from the road into vernal pools and makes those pools particularly salty. And again, these are animals that are environmental indicators. They tell us when something is wrong with the water. So they're soaking up all of this salt into their bodies, and their kidneys actually cannot process it properly. So they end up bloating with water. So they're sucking water into their body and turning essentially into these water balloons. And for a couple of years, we've been seeing this. And initially we thought it was just females that were super pregnant, and we were really excited about that. But as it turns out, these are animals that can barely move because they're so bloated. So they can't breed properly. They can't cross roads well. They can't escape predators. We don't know if it's killing any of them directly yet, but clearly it's not comfortable, probably painful, and impeding them in some way. So we've detected this in Camden. We've detected this in Gray and a few other southern Maine sites. And interestingly, it's only been reported in wood frogs, but we recorded a spring peeper actually in Camden with this issue. As far as we know, we are still the only folks to have seen this in a spring peeper. That was on, I believe it's pronounced the Molyneux Road in Camden. So definitely keep your eyes out this spring. If you see any more that are particularly bloated like this, please take a picture, note the location, and send it to me. So that's everything. Again, thank you everyone, especially for sticking through those technical difficulties. If you would like to stay in touch with the project, those are our social media handles there on the left. Also, please consider donating to the Center for Wildlife Studies to help support projects like this and others. So thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. You could probably turn your video back on. I think that it's probably working now. Your sound is a lot smoother. And again, I thank everyone for sticking with us. The end of the program was certainly worth sticking around for. Let's go ahead and dive into some of these questions. So Mary Jane says, in thinking of the required conditions for them to move, because we've had below freezing temps in the past few days, and then things refreezing and no recent rain, will the temperature and time of year still motivate them to move this week?
Yeah, almost certainly. So while things have frozen, the ground hasn't frozen back into like permafrost, and we don't have like persistent ice over water or anything like that. So when those temperatures kick back up, I think starting tomorrow and then especially on Thursday, that will be enough for amphibians to move, certainly.
Super. By the way, if anyone joined late, please go ahead and feel free to type questions that you have for Greg into the Q&A box located down at the bottom of most of your screens. And we do have some resources also available in the chat box. Ernie and Cindy are asking, are there any amphibian stocking efforts like fish stocking of local streams, ponds, and lakes?
That is a great question. So not currently, not in Maine, but there are some programs with more threatened species where they actually do essentially that, where they stock amphibians. That's typically for your most endangered amphibians out there. When it comes to our common species, a big concern with something like that is disease. And that's something I didn't really touch on here, but amphibians are facing two of what are literally the most deadly wildlife diseases currently out there, called rhinovirus and chytrid fungus, and they can wipe out populations, even entire species, very quickly. So we have to be super careful with things like that. So we aren't currently at a point where we need to do something like a stocking program, or what some people might call like a reintroduction program or captive breeding program. I mean, who knows, maybe farther down the line, if these species become so threatened, that might become necessary.
Yeah, I was shocked when you mentioned that there are these, 70 to 90% mortality rates on some of these roads. It's just, okay. So Laura wants to know, what is the habitat requirement for wood frogs and salamanders in the summer? And what fraction of populations don't need to cross roads?
Ooh, I don't know if I'll have a good answer for that last part. I'll try to give some details, but the first part, typically just regular forests with a lot of leaf litter on the ground, and especially what's called coarse woody debris. So like fresh cut logs and bark, things that they can hide under. Salamanders tend to be more subterranean and like hide among roots of trees, whereas the wood frogs, they'll typically be hiding under leaf litter. So as long as you've got like good leaf coverage, you can have a habitat that supports wood frogs. Salamanders tend to be a little bit more sensitive to their needs. And then as for the percentage that don't need to cross roads, that is a great question. I would say because the majority of Maine is forested, but there's roads even in our most forested areas. That's a hard question. I would bet the majority of amphibians out there are crossing a road of some sort, even if it's just like a pathway, like a walking path. But I don't know the answer to that question. That's a great big think question.
Absolutely. And Laura wants to know, what is the typical or average migration distance for wood frogs and also for spotted salamanders?
So typically it would be about 300 meters or less. But again, wood frogs are kind of the long distance champions of this migration, where they can move pretty far. Spotted salamanders and other salamander species, they tend to like to stick pretty close, so less than 300 meters for sure.
Okay. And Linda wants to know, how is your organization funded for operations, research, and programming?
So we are currently only funded by one grant, which we've tried to stretch to everything we possibly can. Otherwise, it's entirely volunteer based. So I do this in my spare time and I don't get paid for it. I try to pay other people who do like administrative work and more, I don't know, like larger projects for the project, but otherwise we're self-funded and, we take the money we can get, that's for sure.
Okay, we have so many questions coming in. I'm just going to try and jump onto them. Nancy wants to know, the chart of available road sites on the website is coded red and green. Which is available?
So the red are not available and the green are available. That's something I've realized I need to fix to make that clearer. Great question.
Okay, and we have a young man. He says, my name is Alexander. I am 7 and I live in Farmington. I am excited to do the big night for my first time this year with my mom and my best friend and his mom. That's very
Yes.
cool.
Yes,
Awesome.
Alexander. That's how old I was when I started, buddy.
I have 7-year-old twins. We might have to consider doing this too.
Oh, man.
And well, speaking of participating in Big Night, Bob wants to know, does 2021 certification carry over to 2022?
If you were certified in 2021 and you submitted data, then you are good to go. If you were certified in 2021 but did not submit data, we just want to make sure you're like up to date and not rusty on like your ID. So we ask you to recertify.
Okay.
Great question.
Super. Sally wants to know, if a vernal pool freezes, will with eggs in it, will they die?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would suspect if the eggs themselves were actually frozen, then yes. But the eggs are, while they're mostly water, they're kind of like a gelatinous mass. So I don't know if the physical mass that makes them up, if that might be able to withstand some freezing, but I don't actually know. That's a great question.
Jermaine wants to know, are there 2 species of spotted salamander, yellow spotted and she says, and spotted, or are they the same species?
So there are 2. We call one of them spotted salamander, which is the one you're seeing on the screen. That's the one with yellow spots. And then there's the blue spotted salamander. So that's the one that's like kind of black with some blue spots. So it's a little confusing that we call one blue spotted and then one just spotted. So some people call them yellow spotted. Some people like, yeah, you see what I'm saying there. So yes, there are 2 species.
And Sheila wants to know, should you wear gloves when you pick up salamanders and frogs?
Great question. So if you can get your hands on powder-free nitrile gloves, those are great for handling amphibians. Otherwise, if you have to use your bare hands, make sure your hands are very clean, not with hand sanitizer, no lotion, no like spicy foods, deodorant, cleaning agents, anything like that. Basically, if you have something on your hands and you were to touch your eyes with it, if that burns, it feels pretty similar to an amphibian, and in some cases it can even cause death. So make sure if you're out there touching amphibians with your bare hands, you're doing it with clean ones and wet ones.
Super. Emily wants to know, what type of data do the volunteers collect?
Yeah, a lot of data and very useful data. So the most important is typically the number of animals you're seeing alive and the number dead, and you're identifying each species. So we have like this tally sheet of different species, and you just tally like how many alive you're seeing of spotted salamanders and then how many dead. And so that for a variety of species, we have a tally for the number of cars you're seeing, because again, the number of cars passing is super important to predicting mortality rates. So we ask people to record how many cars drive past, temperature, what the rain is doing, when you start and end your survey, how many people are surveying with you, and then any other relevant notes that you think are important to know.
Okay. Nancy wants to know, do you have info on the special tunnels and how to install them that one could take to town councils?
Yeah, so I have a few sources that I could probably send your way. If you want to send me an email, I can send you some information. We are actively applying for a grant. There's a great program that just came through with like the big infrastructure bill last fall through Congress. Basically, that gave $350 million to wildlife crossing structures. So it's a competitive grant system. We're planning on applying through Maine Big Night with Maine Department of Transportation, but if other towns want to get involved as well, that would improve our chances of successfully getting that grant for crossing structures.
Kate has a comment about the crossing structures too. She says, I was involved in a Salamander Tunnel project in Western Mass at a high mortality site, which required annual maintenance. Unsure of the practicality of this solution. Are you familiar with that Western Mass?
Yeah, I think that was probably the site that I showed in Amherst, if I were to guess. And I have heard that that design required a decent amount of maintenance. I think the more recent designs, because if I remember correctly, that was from a while ago, like a couple decades ago, and things have come quite a long way since then. So structures now seem to be a little bit more resilient, and there's different like considerations even for not only improving resiliency, but also improving the actual usage by the target animal. So it's definitely something to consider, because it's a costly project. You want to make sure you do it right.
And Christine wants to know, is there any way to advise local traffic to avoid areas during this migration?
Yes and no. So in some cases, some folks are able to actually get entire roads shut down in order to allow migrations to occur peacefully. That's really hard to do, because you have to not only get the town on board, you have to get law enforcement to make sure that nobody's like going down these roads, or like DOT signage. And inevitably some people are going to be upset because they're inconvenienced. So it's really hard to pull off. It's not unheard of. Otherwise, I mean, just spreading the word, like, hey, if it's possible, don't travel on this road on Thursday night, like that would be fantastic. But there's no other system I can think of that's like official way of notifying people to not travel on certain roads.
Do you have examples of towns cooperating in terms of reducing the amount of snow salt getting into the roadside vernal pools? Wondering how the town of Camden might respond to salt issues on Mullineaux, advice on who to contact, etc.
Yeah, so I don't personally have the information for all of that, but the website that's listed there on the left, the vernalpools.me website, there is a lot of information about exactly what you're asking there. So who's interacting with us on reducing road salt, how that's going. And if you can't find that information, I can certainly reach out to the person who does know. I do know that we have a variety of people that we are working with, and it sounds like it's going fairly well. Mostly from what I understand, it's just reducing the amount of salt that's being dumped out, because apparently it's just like a precautionary level of salt, but I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about salts for keeping roads safe, but yeah, there is information on our website. Great questions.
Okay, super. We have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. Cindy wants to know, do you tally toads?
Yes, so we tally every species that we see. We've seen every species in Maine except one, which is the spring salamander. So yeah, we definitely count toads.
Okay. Sharon wants to know, I just got certified, so I am excited to do this. We have a dirt road in the nearby town where we've seen lots of amphibians crossing in other years. How do we get this to be a site on your list so that we can gather data there this year?
Excellent question. Just email me and tell me whereabouts that site is, especially like where those high concentrations are. And then I'll work on getting that registered, and then I will adopt the site up to you and you can survey it.
Super. Bob wants to know, what are your thoughts about trapping overnight so that people can look at them during the day?
So it depends on what the purpose is for. So for example, I had a talk, I actually just had to reschedule this one, but I had one coming up where I was going to be doing a live vernal pool program. But because it's really hard to get people out to vernal pools at night when it's raining, I was planning on putting some minnow traps out to show people these amphibians. So I think in that instance, it's okay, because it's, you know, you're sharing a really important story with these people and gaining advocacy. But if you're not doing it for an educational or conservation purpose, then you're probably just doing more harm than good, causing these animals stress and preventing them from breeding. So make sure it's for the right reasons, certainly.
That's good advice. Sally has a bit of a question here. Let's see. We have ponds on our residential small acre to which salamanders are coming every year. One pond had eggs, but I did not manage to set up a water filter and pump in time. The water degraded, changed the water too late, I think. What does it take for eggs to hatch if water is either still or replaced with tap?
Honestly, it would probably be just fine without having to be replaced. Now, I would be a little more concerned about replacing it with tap, because tap water, you could have heavy metals or chlorine in them, and that's neither of those are good for the amphibians. So still water, I mean, these eggs are being laid in still water anyway in a vernal pool. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. What I would be more concerned about is either algae buildup or if it dries out before they can metamorphose into adults. And so if algae gets built up, you might not be getting as much oxygen in there as you should. Otherwise, it sounds like it could probably do just fine on its own as long as you have water in there.
Thank you so much, Greg. So if anyone else has questions for Greg, I see there's a couple little comments in there. Go ahead and reach out to him. That's probably the best way to get your questions answered. And we are just so delighted that you came to speak to us tonight about this project. It was something that I again, just had no idea that the mortality was so high in certain areas. So this is very important information for us. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is the first program in our new series with the Center for Wildlife Studies. And I do encourage you to visit their website, see all that they have going on, and be sure to come back for more of our programs online and in person coming up very soon. The next program, in fact, is next week. It's on April 5th, and we are going to be learning what marine birds can tell us about the state of the ocean. So visit librarycamden.org and you can sign up there. And I hope to see you next week. Greg, thank you again for doing this with us tonight. This was very informative, and keep up the good work. This is awesome.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for telling me about the technical issues. And thanks for everyone for your patience. I look forward to seeing you out there.
Okay, best wishes. Tell your family thanks for shutting off their movie.
Yeah, will do.
All right, good night, everyone. Bye-bye.